I'm very, very pleased to be here. It's a pleasure to be here and to participate in the Marney History Festival. There's so many fascinating talks. Clearly, and I don't need to tell you this, that Tracy Borman is an absolute professional performer and very difficult to follow. But I'm doing it, and I shall do my best. So as you've heard, I'm curator at Westminster Abbey, where we have a unique collection of wooden and wax funeral effigies. We redisplayed them recently in a wonderful medieval space called the Queen's Diamond Jubilee Galleries, which is open to the public, and I encourage you to come and visit. It's slightly unnerving that I'm having to look behind to check what I'm seeing, so I'm hoping to follow this clearly enough. What I do recommend, and I probably shouldn't, but if you come to the Abbey, and hopefully you will come regularly, perhaps you might consider joining the association, the Westminster Abbey Association, because it's much cheaper than coming in repetitively. So for a year, I mean, this isn't me trying to sell you something, this is me trying to give you a good deal, because it really is much more cost efficient to come in that way. And you can't visit the galleries separate from the overall visit of the Abbey, and they're in a separate entrance at Poets' Corner. I mean, I can talk more about them later, but I've been invited to talk to you today about our funeral effigies, which are up in the gallery, and the connection between Marney Tower and the effigies at Westminster Abbey may or may not be obvious now. I mean, you've sat through a day of talks and there are more tomorrow, but I thought I should recap that our wonderful hosts are commemorating the 500th anniversary of the death of Henry I Lord Marney, and they discovered that an effigy was created for his funeral in 1523. They bravely recreated the effigy, and on the 15th and 16th of July this year, they defied the elements to process with it from Lord Marney's place of death in London to Marney Chapel. And perhaps some of you joined them on a stage of the walk. I did, and I have never been wetter. It was very, very wet. But Tim Duke, who's sadly not here, presented a talk at the College of Arms, and then we followed to the various churches. And then the next day, there was an even longer walk to Chingford, following the College of Arms manuscript describing the funeral procession. So in my talk, I'm going to explore the idea of funeral effigies. Firstly, we will look at what is a funeral effigy. Next, briefly, we'll examine what we know about Henry Lord Marney's funeral effigy. Then we'll look at Westminster Abbey's unique collection of medieval wooden funeral effigies and their redisplay. And lastly, the Abbey's equally amazing and even more lifelike wax funeral effigies. So first of all, what is a funeral effigy and what was it for? So this is what it is not. It's very easy to get confused. This is the tomb effigy of Edward III in the Confessor's Shrine at Westminster Abbey. You can see that it's part of his permanent monument. It's made of gilt bronze, possibly by John Orchard, in about 1387. That's 10 years after his death. It took that long, many monarchs did think very carefully about where they were to be buried and what was going to memorialize them, but often it hadn't actually been made. And in this case, it took 10 years to create this. So, put simply, a funeral effigy is a sculpted figure that was used at a funeral and which stood in for the corpse of a deceased monarch. This is an image of Richard II. Though, as we have learned in the case of Lord Marney, effigies were also sometimes created for non-royal funerals. And I'm sure that was to associate them with royal practice, to make them part of the court that they actually, to make them seem more, to reflect their status. The practice is believed to have originated in medieval England, and the first recorded example of a wooden funeral effigy is in 1327 for the burial of King Edward II at Gloucester Abbey. This effigy does not survive. From this time on, funeral effigies were used at royal funeral ceremonies until the execution of Charles I in 1649, and a similar tradition also developed in Europe. There are pockets of effigies in Italy, in France, in aristocratic families. But at Westminster Abbey, we have a unique collection of royal medieval funeral effigies, an exceptional collection of historic lifelike sculpture. Contemporaries referred to the funeral effigy as a representation or a picture or an image of the deceased monarch. The figure was created to resemble and represent the deceased person, and it was dressed in garments borrowed from the Great Wardrobe, kitted out for the funeral with items of regalia, including an orb and sceptre, which were then returned to store. The description of King Edward II's effigy body says that it was dressed in the king's coronation robes, which included a tunic, dalmatic, girdle, mantle, buskins, sandals, spurs, and cap of estate, together with another crown of silver gilt, a sceptre, 2 florins of silver gilt, and a ring of silver gilt with a great doublet. So it's intended to display the institutional insignia of kingship. As you will see, most of the Abbey's medieval funeral effigies are naked. For instance, here's the figure of King Edward III, and I find this very undignified. When I'm up in the galleries, we know that this effigy was never intended to be seen like this. As we've just heard, the clothes that the effigy was dressed in, and wig and eyebrows, everything was brought in, created, put on him, on the effigy, at the funeral, and then elements returned to the royal wardrobe. So there were the 2 main reasons for creating a funeral effigy. I mean, they're very, very bizarre, but they're also absolutely fascinating, and so I do hope you come and see them properly. The first reason for creating them was practical, and the second was philosophical. The practical reason was that there could sometimes be several weeks between death and burial. Depending on the circumstances of death, it was also possible that the face or the body of the monarch could be disfigured. In addition, medieval royal funeral practice was to remove the bowels, to eviscerate the body for better preservation, and sometimes to send body parts for symbolic burial to other kingdoms. For instance, the heart of Plantagenet King Henry III, who died in 1272, was sent to France and buried in the Abbey Church of Fontevraud in Anjou. And the Lancastrian king, Henry V, who died in France in 1422, although his body was brought back for burial at Westminster Abbey, apparently a casket with his internal organs was left behind outside Paris. So this would obviously have contributed to the disfigurement of the corpse. I'm going to say at this point, because it ties in with Henry V, there is one book that lovely James from Aldborough Bookshop has brought here about Henry V, which talks about the Chantry Chapel, his burial rites, and shows you the platform on which his tomb effigy is laid. But we don't have his funeral effigy. So the body could begin to putrefy. The real body would be embalmed with spices and wrapped in wax cloth for burial. This was another good reason for putting the body in the coffin for procession and displaying an inert wooden effigy on top of the hearse. I mean, nothing could be more inert than that, I think you'd agree. And it was important that the public had a last glimpse of the royal figure. I mean, this is all, to a degree, I mean, just like the progress is, it's royal propaganda. It's, you know, you have no YouTube, you have no, film, you have precious little newspaper. Not everyone can read. Well, at this time, people couldn't read. So it's vital that the public actually see the king's body being processed, but it's kind of also important that they don't see it in an ill state. They see it in a glorious state, and that's kind of the point of it. There was traditionally an impressive procession through the streets of London from the Tower via St. Paul's Cathedral to Westminster Abbey. I suppose a contemporary analogy, and one that we've all lived through recently, was the funeral last September of Queen Elizabeth II, who died in Scotland, and then the various stages of her procession from Balmoral to Edinburgh, London, and then finally Windsor. I mean, I felt, I don't know, I mean, the historic precedents were very close, and I felt perfectly sorry for the fact that you had to move, people had to see, and people had to walk around in Westminster Hall, her coffin, basically, but not, she didn't have an effigy, and her body was in the coffin. This is the procession on the 28th of April 1603, the funeral procession showing the effigy body of Elizabeth I. So I congratulate myself on following on from Tracy and showing you kind of the last slide that she might have shown you. We do actually have Elizabeth I's effigy body, but it's a very complicated story. We now only have, we have her corset, which I think I will be showing you later, with a sort of truncated legs and no head and a plaster sort of top bit. And in 1760, the Abbey created another Elizabeth I because it would, as now, encourage people to come and see these effigies, and therefore they wanted to have them looking more modern, I guess. But the 1760 effigy, which has a wax head, is for me just disappointing. What really counts is the effigy body with Elizabeth's corset, which would have been the one that was processed here. A good description of the preparation of the effigy body for the procession and ceremony and the real body for burial is for King Henry VIII's funeral in 1547. It shows the extent of the preparation and effort to make the effigy accurately represent the king. A scholar called Mariah Haywood from the State Papers has transcribed the preparation of Henry VIII's body. He was buried on the 14th of February, 1547. Commandment was given to the apothecary, surgeons, wax chandlers, and others to do their duties in spurging, cleansing, bowling, searing, which is to do with wax, embalming, furnishing, and dressing with spices the said corpse, and also for wrapping the same in cerecloth, which is wax cloth, of many folds, over the fine cloth of rains and velvet, surely bound and trammelled with cords of silk, which was done and executed of them accordingly, as to the dignity of such a mighty prince it appertaineth. At the same time, the picture, Henry VIII's effigy, was made very like unto the King's Majesty's person, both in stature, favour, form, and apparel, the which was laid along upon the coffin, with two great cushions under his head, the crown imperial of England of gold set with precious stones, and under that a nightcap of black satin set full of stone and gold was upon his head. The picture was apparelled with robes of crimson velvet, furred with miniver, powdered with ermines, the collar of the garter with the George about his neck, a crimson satin doublet embroidered with gold, 2 bracelets of gold about his wrists, set with stone and pearl, a fair armouring sword by his side, the sceptre in his right hand, and the ball, the orb, in his left hand, a pair of new gloves with many rings, set with rich stones on his fingers. And that's the extent of dressing of the effigy. So this account for Henry VIII's funeral indicates the care that was taken to create an image that resembled the king. The second reason for creating a funeral effigy was a philosophical one. In a time of political instability, it was important to emphasize continuity of rule. The king is dead, long live the king. Some scholars believe that for contemporaries, the funeral effigy signified the continuing existence of the dead monarch up to the moment of burial, even including where power was located in the period between the death of one monarch and the inauguration of the next. The distinction was between the mortal body, which was encased in a coffin, and immortal majesty, which never dies. In France, the effigy was treated as if it was alive. For instance, in 1515, the funeral effigy of Louis XII was ceremonially served meals by members of his household. And in 1547, the effigy of Henry VIII's contemporary, Francis I of France, lay in state on a richly decorated bed. And that's one of the reasons that the effigies were articulated, so they could be more easily dressed and they could be sat up. I mean, there was an exhibition at Versailles about the funeral ceremonials relating to the French kings, and there's lots of wax elements to it, but it feels very uncanny, and I'm not clear, apart from for James I, that in England quite such reverence was paid to our funeral effigies, but certainly they were very carefully prepared, carefully dressed, and were expected to be as close as possible to what, as you heard, Henry VIII, the figure of Henry VIII, but probably not as heavy as his actual body was to be on top, because his real body was inside the coffin. After the funeral, there was no further use for the effigy figures, which is why they are rare survivals, as they tended to be discarded. At Westminster Abbey, they have experienced neglect in the past. At Westminster Abbey, they have experienced neglect in the past, but are now carefully cared for as part of the collection. Turning briefly to Lord Marney's funeral effigy, Henry First Baron Marney, who died on the 24th of May 1523 and was buried in Marney Chapel on the 4th of June 1523 after a procession and elaborate funeral ceremony. I'm sure you will all make a beeline to the chapel if you haven't been yet. So, as I said, it was unusual but not unprecedented for a funeral effigy to be created for a nobleman like Lord Marney. And it is, of course, this sort of funeral ceremony that underlines his status as an important Tudor courtier with close ties to the monarchy. We've probably heard quite a lot, we will hear more tomorrow as well, about his importance as a courtier, but he was one of the executors of Henry VIII's grandmother, Lady Margaret Beaufort, who is also buried, of course, at Westminster Abbey. And he became a Knight of the Garter in 1510, and just before his death in February 1523, he became Lord Privy Seal. Sheila very kindly asked me if I would like to contribute, to be part of the making of the effigy. I did, oh yes, which you see, for those of you who didn't experience it here, and I actually wasn't here when it arrived, there you see it. He's in armour, and there you see it on the chariot. So I would say, very, very good result. Something well worth celebrating. I mean, it's true that the effigies themselves can be dressed in various things. I wasn't sure that we definitely knew he was wearing armour, a suit of armour, but they frequently would have been. They were often covered with amazing cloth of gold, very rich cloth of gold, and I think that the horses and the processional chariot, exceptional recreation. Very well done, very well done. That's from my professional view there, so thank you. The effigy was probably created to represent Lord Marney on the long procession back from his place of death in the City of London to Marney Chapel for just the same reasons as the royal ones, in that I'm looking to my host. I don't know if he was eviscerated, disemboweled, his heart was chested. Yes, I did know that. Okay, sorry. So according to a letter at the College of Arms, for which many thanks to Tim Duke, Lord Marney's body was cured and chested, that is, eviscerated and embalmed, and then put in a coffin. It was conveyed back to Marney on a chariot, which was covered with a cloth of black velvet, and on that a white cross of satin, and within the said chariot was on the said corpse a cloth black with a white cross. And apparently the bales of the said chariot were open, so that a representation of the body, the cloth of gold and hearse cloth, might be seen. I don't know how extensive were the lands that Lord Marney owned, and we know that he died in his sort of house on the east side of London. The idea would be that he kind of processed through his lands to be buried in his chapel, certainly with the expectation that everybody would come out and line the route and pray. I mean, that the body stopped at various churches on the way and services took place. This is absolutely similar to the royal funerals, where, for instance, Edward III died at his palace in Sheen, and the procession of the body with the effigy took a very long route round, coming over a London bridge to the Tower. And then the final bit from St. Paul's to Westminster Abbey was always the same, but it sort of depended where the monarch had died, which palace he died at, as to where he came in from. Turning now to Westminster Abbey, here's an image of the Queen's Diamond Jubilee Galleries showing many of the effigies. They came to be known as the Ragged Regiment. And perhaps you can see why in this image, 1786, where John Carter, a very interesting man in his own right, showed how various elements of the effigies were kind of rotting around them. This is in the upper chapel, actually of Henry V's Chantry Chapel. At the point that the royal corpse was buried, as we've heard, these effigy bodies were no longer needed, and they were left in the abbey following the various royal funerals. Throughout the 20th century, they were on view in the smaller Undercroft Museum in the Abbey Cloister, but in 2018, they were redisplayed in the Queen's Diamond Jubilee Galleries. They're displayed reclining in the position that they would have occupied when they entered the Abbey on top of a coffin. And we call these specially designed cases morgue drawer cases. Maybe you can sort of see why, because they pull out, making them easier to open so that our conservation team can do a more thorough condition check and examine the whole body more easily. The funeral effigies have long been considered worth visiting, so they're all waiting for you. A record of 1561 states that the Abbey's chief verger had custody and oversight of the tombs and monuments and of the pictures of kings and queens, and showed them to paying visitors. And in 1606, King James I brought his brother-in-law, Christian IV of Denmark, to see them. They were apparently particularly interested in the effigy of Queen Elizabeth I, who'd recently died, and they actually newly beautified, amended, and adorned with royal vestures for the occasion, and displayed in a wooden press or cupboard the effigy. So not only do we have the tomb monument that Tracy showed you to Elizabeth I, but her effigy body was something that was of interest, perhaps because it was painted, it was seen to be more lifelike. And so they rushed to reclothe it for the visit in 1606. And that's quite a strange thing to think about, because James I made sure that in the Abbey, his mother, Mary, Queen of Scots, got a more magnificent tomb, one could argue, than Queen Elizabeth I. But we didn't have an effigy for her, so he couldn't show Christian IV of Denmark. And an extraordinary collection of historic royal portraiture. I'll just introduce them to you briefly, running through chronologically. Otherwise, I was trying to think how I would make this interesting. Here's one, here's one, here's one. But I think you'd be cheated if I don't at least show you what they look like. The earliest one is the effigy of Edward III, who died in 1377, who you've just seen. And I'm going to talk about him in more detail in a minute. Then we've got Queen Catherine de Valois, who died in 1437, the widow of Henry V on the right, and Queen Anne of Bohemia, wife of Richard II, who died in 1394. Next, we've got Elizabeth of York, wife of Henry VII, who died in 1503, and Henry VII, who died in 1509. Then we've got Mary Tudor, who died in 1558, and her sister, Elizabeth I. This is the corset that I was talking about. And we haven't done any dendro, we haven't done any tree ring testing on the legs of the corset, partly because it's pine, partly because our conservators were resistant, and it probably wouldn't actually show us whether that was her original legs, as it were. But we believe that the corset was on the original effigy body, and so we've displayed it separately. And I'm very regretful that I haven't yet put a tape measure around it to see what what her waist size was. But I think that it's perfectly possible, since Elizabeth didn't like her portraits to show her, in 1603, just before her death, she wouldn't have liked to have been portrayed as an older lady. So she would probably have liked the trim waist of her youth. That's my suspicion she probably wasn't actually that thin. Then we have Henry, Prince of Wales, son of James I, who died in 1612. His mother, Queen Anne of Denmark, who died in 1619. and his father James I, who died in 1625. And this is what they look like, which is why I had to tell you what they would have looked like when they came into the Abbey and why they are so important, because they are absolutely unique, but they have lost, many of them have lost, actually physically lost the rest of their body. The execution of King Charles I in 1649 seems to have ended this particular wooden form of commemoration, and we'll look later at the wax effigies that succeeded them. But if we go back to Edward III for a moment, he's our oldest effigy. As you heard, Edward II had a funeral effigy, but that doesn't survive, and he wasn't buried at Westminster Abbey, whereas Edward III, I showed you his tomb monument as not being his effigy. He was England's longest reigning monarch to date, and his reign saw triumphs in the 100 Years' War, the Battle of Crecy in 1346, mixed with disasters such as the Black Death, which decimated the country in 1348. And his son, Edward the Black Prince, died in 1376, so did not succeed him. And as we've heard, the effigy was described as a representation or image or picture of the monarch, and was intended to stand in for his physical body at the funeral. People often ask me how close the effigies are to what the figures looked like, which is, I wasn't there, but all I can say is that despite the sometimes crude carving, there is clearly an attempt at portraiture. So this life-size sculpture of Edward III measures 5 feet 10.5 inches tall, and was therefore probably intended to be close to the king's physical dimensions. It's made from a hollowed out piece of walnut, and here I'm giving you privileged information because when you're at the Abbey, you will not be able to see the back of it. So you can see that it's hollowed out. The face is painted with applied plaster, which seems to show a distortion on the left side of the mouth. There is an argument that this was originally a death mask, made from a death mask, and the distorted mouth shows evidence of the stroke that afflicted the king's left side and contributed to his death. There are marks where a beard was once attached, and the head was covered by a wig and crown, which explains why no ears were carved, because they wouldn't have been visible. The hands were carved separately and inserted into the holes, but they're now lost. And lost too is the applied facial hair. Apparently the eyebrows were made from the hairs of a small dog, and we were going to put that in the little film that you see explaining the use of the effigies in the galleries. And someone said, well, how do we know it was a small dog? So we took out small. But much of this research is based on, between 2014 and our opening in 2018, our conservators did a lot of looking, and we did a lot of talking to other scholars about these, but it's also based on some work in the 1980s by Harvey and Mortimer, Richard Mortimer, who was the archivist, and Anthony Harvey, who's one of the canons. And the book that they published, sadly, it's no longer in print, but they worked with scholars such as Philip Lindley and V&A conservators, and they published a lot of information about the various different layers. We've got some additional information, which I actually published with a conservator colleague in the Burlington magazine in January 2019. But the sort of speed with which we had to get everything prepared for the galleries slightly meant that we had to, put the research side, to one side to pick up later. What does survive are fragments of red silk textile, which represents some kind of undergarment. A number of nails and nail holes on the effigy itself indicate where the textile was attached to the effigy, and fragments of a linen-type textile in the groin area suggest that the crotch may have been padded. You can sort of make it out there. Happily, Edward III's funeral ceremony is well documented. In June 1377, the keeper of the king's wardrobe, Richard de Beverley, who was responsible for organising the funeral, received about £1,800 for diverse expenses made for the exequies of the Lord, recently King of England and France deceased. And de Beverley handed over £21 of that to Roger Chaundler for keeping the body of the king from putrefaction with balsam and other unguents and oils, followed by a further £22, 4 shillings, and 11 pence was paid to Stephen Hadley for making an image in the likeness of the king, and various other work done by him about the preparation of the Lord King's body before the day of burial, suggesting the close link between embalming the king's body and the creation of a funeral effigy. It's almost as if they have to happen simultaneously, because you can't put the body of the king in the coffin without having something representing the king whilst he's not yet been entombed in Westminster Abbey. As I was preparing this talk, I thought it might be interesting. I'd take a moment to consider the process of embalming. It seems that wax chandlers were frequently involved in preparations for embalming the royal corpse with smelly unguents, probably containing wax, and desiccants before wrapping it tightly in waxed cloth. A description of how to do this, the rubrics for the royal exequies, De Exequis Regalibus, appears in an important manuscript in the Abbey's collection called the Littlington Missal, and this is also on view in the galleries. It dates from 1383 to 84 and was paid for by a very wealthy abbot, Nicholas Littlington, at that period. It describes how the waxed embalming cloth should cover the royal body, apart from the face and beard, and be sewn around the fingers and thumb individually, as if his hands were covered with linen gloves, before the body was dressed in an ankle-length tunic and royal cloak over it. Apparently, the beard should be carefully arranged on the chest, and the head and face should be covered with a silk handkerchief. Just to be clear, this is the royal body before it's put in the coffin. The regalia to accompany the body was described. There should be a crown or diadem on the head. The hands should be covered with gloves, and a gold ring placed on the middle finger of the right hand. The orb placed in the right hand with the golden rod surmounted by a cross lying on the dead king's chest. In his left hand, he should hold a gilded scepter. The shins and feet should be covered with silk stockings and slippers, and the regalia was actually the king's personal set of regalia, I understand. So King Edward III died at his palace of Sheen near Richmond on the 21st of June 1377, and he was buried at Westminster Abbey 2 weeks later on the 5th of July. So he only had 2 weeks to be kind of doing the rounds and gradually getting closer to Westminster Abbey. His funeral procession left Sheen on the 3rd of July and included a torchlit procession which accompanied the coffin to St. Paul's Cathedral. When the funeral party arrived at Westminster Abbey, this is very anachronistic, but I'm quite keen to show you, the coffin and effigy were placed within a candle-decked hearse at the foot of the steps leading to the high altar. This is one of my favourite exhibits in the Queen's Diamond Jubilee Galleries, although it's the mortuary roll of Abbot John Islip, and it dates from 1532. But when we were working on the exhibition, we found that it was about the only image that shows the Abbey before the Reformation. So if you, and it's in pen and ink, it's very difficult to see, but we have some raking light photographs, and this is taken from that. And you can see, sorry, I'm told I don't need to, anyway, you can see the, okay, yeah. This is the candle, these are the candles of the hearse. So it's a kind of magnificent, massive structure. Here's the high altar. Here's the sort of an image of Christ before it was before the whole of the Abbey high altar, before the Reformation hit the Abbey in 1540. Here are monks, canons, with their tapers, and here will be the body of John Islip. So this just shows you. I mean, this is the abbot of Westminster Abbey. It's not the king, but this is already quite a good illustration of the sort of lighting and atmosphere and preparation around the high altar for a burial. After the burial, the effigy continued to be exhibited in the church and became the property of the Abbey authorities. Displayed next to so this is Queen Catherine de Valois. She died in 1437. She's displayed next to the effigy body of Edward III in the Abbey galleries, and she's the widow of Henry V. There are no surviving images of Catherine, so no portraits, making this sculpture a very important historic piece of royal portraiture. She's carved from a single piece of oak, again hollowed out at the back. Her right arm was made from an additional piece of wood attached at the shoulder by 2 dowels, and you can see that it's been lost. The deep groove around the top of her head made it easier to attach a crown and wig. The red sleeves and square neckline and carved skirt folds, painted over gesso, formed an underlayer for the textiles that were attached over them, and there are a lot of nails and nail holes visible, suggesting that the textile, where the textile garment was nailed. It seems very strange that they would have bothered to create that, because they didn't need to. They could just have put something over the top of her. I mean, she was going to be dressed. But my feeling is perhaps the carvers either didn't get a clear instruction, or they just thought, well, this is what we should do. We shouldn't prepare a naked body. We should prepare something for dressing that already looks dressed. During conservation work, tiny textile fragments were discovered under the nails, indicating that the garment was made of velvet with a crimson pile warp and a black main warp. So the Queen was probably dressed in a robe royale of matching mantle, surcoat and tunic, and the nail holes reflect this. We've got no payments for this effigies production, but it was almost certainly dressed in a mantle of purple satin with matching surcoat and tunic and crown, a purple girdle, 2 rings and a sceptre, according to accounts that list the delivery of these items to the keeper of the vestry at Westminster Abbey. We're getting closer in time to Lord Marney's Tudor effigy. This is the effigy of Henry VII's Queen Elizabeth of York, which was used at her funeral in Westminster Abbey on the 23rd of February 1503, 12 days after her death. She died at the Tower of London on the 11th of February 1503, shortly after the birth of her last child. And if you look carefully, I think you can actually see Catherine de Valois at the top. I think that's Elizabeth of York on the far right, and then that's Henry VII. And this is a photograph taken just after the war, showing what had happened to them, very sadly. Her funeral is said to have cost over £3,000. The funeral effigy departs from convention because it's not completely made of wood. Its body was made of textile stuffed with hay, and that's partly why the fabric body had deteriorated beyond repair, with water ingress into the museum that they were formerly exhibited in, although the wooden head and bust survive. So the head is made of 4 planks of wood, and there is an attached articulated wooden left arm, which you can see, jointed at the elbow to facilitate its dressing, and a very delicate pear wood hand. The work was supervised by Richard Gibson, yeoman tailor for the Great Wardrobe, and Gibson received £3 for her picture making, and he employed Master Lawrence, who was a well-known German sculptor called Lawrence Emler, with Frederick, his mate, to carve the head, for which they were paid 13 shillings and £4. The hands were carved by a craftsman named Wetchen and his co-worker Hans van Hoof for 4 shillings. And Master Henry received 4 shillings to paint the effigy. The work that's going on at historical palaces around creation of movable tents, and the workshops were probably all interchangeable. This was not necessarily expert work, but you had to be in the circle of the sergeant painter in order to be given this. The effigy hair was hired. Payments survived to the mercer for 9 yards of crimson satin for a garment for the said picture, and 1.25 yards for the black velvet trim, and this garment was nailed onto the effigy. And if you look carefully, you can still see strips of fabric at the neckline and wrists, and fragments attached to the right shoulder, which are remnants of dress. I think you actually can make that out. And there's a fragment from the dress, which was removed from the effigy and looks more gold than crimson. And a very interesting medieval textile historian did some recent scientific analysis to show that it was originally a red dye, that the gold, it's just faded. It was a dye called sappanwood, which doesn't keep red. So that's why we now have gold bits that have come off the effigy body. Accounts describe how the effigy body lay on a chest placed above the corpse, covered with black velvet with a cross of cloth of silver, and conveyed on a chariot drawn by 6 horses. A contemporary saw an image or personage like a queen, clothed in the very robes of estate of the queen, having her very rich crown on her head, her hair about her shoulder, her sceptre in her right hand, and her fingers well garnished with rings of gold and precious stones, which is partly why they took such care carving the fingers so that they could easily put the rings on and off. And after the service, while the corpse was buried, the image with the crown and the rich robes were taken to a secret place by St. Edward's shrine, perhaps hidden away in the chapel of St. Edward the Confessor, and then left at the Abbey. Our most popular funeral effigy in the galleries is that of Westminster, is that of Henry VII. This is all that we've got left is the effigy head of Elizabeth of York's husband. He died at Richmond Palace on the 21st of April, 1509, and on the 9th of May, his funeral procession passed over London Bridge to St. Paul's Cathedral, and then continued to Westminster Abbey, where he was buried on the 10th of May. An account in the College of Arms describes how the king's body was put on a chariot, covered in black cloth, taken in procession, with over the corpse an image or representation of the late king, laid on cushions of gold, apparelled in his rich robes of estate, with a crown on his head, ball and sceptre in his hand, and environed with banners of arms of all his dominions. Actually, it's tradition, it's precedent. What Edward III did, Henry VII is going to do, and so is Henry VIII. So at some level, I'm just telling you the same thing over and over again, but it's sort of reassuring, and it's the relevant context behind the effigies. The effigy body, or king's picture, cost £6, 12 shillings and 8p to make. It was dressed in a purple satin gown. It is Parliament robes, not his coronation dress. And this wonderful effigy head is all that remains of this representation, for which we have a description in 1907, which is what it looked. This is what it looked like then. A well-modelled, complete figure of a man, 6 feet 1 inch high, consists of a wooden core padded with hay and covered with canvas. The head is finely modelled and painted. The skull has been left bare for a wig. The body has been painted and is now of a grey colour. The left hand, which is loose and modelled on a wire foundation, which is already gone by then, is hollowed as if to support the orb. The right hand probably held the sceptre, but is broken off and lost. The feet are broken off, but remain. So when we were designing the galleries, our designers, who are called Muma, who worked on the V&A's medieval and Renaissance galleries, which are absolutely beautiful, and I really wanted to work with them, they kept asking me, where's Henry VII's body? And we really had nothing to display, because further damage has left the body looking like this. And it was originally made of stuffed canvas. So I kept saying, well, it's only old coat hangers now, which is what we've got. But the surviving effigy head is amazingly lifelike and is believed to be based on a death mask, possibly made by Pietro Torrigiano, who was an important Florentine sculptor who worked on, who was commissioned for the tomb monument of Lady Margaret Beaufort and for Henry VII and Elizabeth of York. But I feel that you can read the character of the king in his face. A contemporary description says his appearance was remarkably attractive, and his face was cheerful, especially when speaking, but he's not speaking here. His eyes were small and blue, his teeth few, poor and blackish, his hair was thin and white, his complexion sallow. His spirit was distinguished, wise and prudent. His mind was brave and resolute. He had a most pertinacious memory. He was not devoid of scholarship. He was gracious and kind and was as attentive to his visitors as he was easy of access. He was fond of having foreigners at his court, but those of his subjects who were indebted to him and who did not pay him due honour, or who were generous only with promises, he treated with harsh severity. He well knew how to maintain his royal majesty and all which appertains to kingship at every time and in every place. This is also supposed to be based on a death mask, and there's a very interesting comparison of this effigy head with a terracotta bust of Henry VII by Torrigiano in the V&A. But as I said, Torrigiano created both of these two wonderful monuments in the Lady Chapel, Henry VII's chapel at Westminster Abbey. Torrigiano was certainly at court in 1511 when he was commissioned to produce Lady Margaret Beaufort's tomb monument. And in 1512, he kept coming and going. He sort of disappeared and ended up leaving England, possibly with many of his commissions unfinished, for instance, the high altar in the Lady Chapel. But this comparison of our funeral effigy with the V&A plaster bust shows, well, partly how many cycles of restoration our bust has gone through. It lost its nose at one point, but also the very close dimensional relationship. And they're both believed to be based on the same death mask, actually, but very difficult to prove that. And what I'd actually like to do, though I haven't got the technology at the moment, is look at the tomb monument and compare all three to see how close they actually are. So we're going from the sublime to the ridiculous. This is the funeral effigy of James I, James Stuart, who died in 1625 at his house Tibbles in Hertfordshire. It's the last royal funeral effigy to survive in the medieval tradition with a wooden body, but sadly the peg shows you we lost the head, which was clearly added separately and probably made by somebody different. The arms are also lost, but it has distinctive legs, which are now held on with these rather unattractive iron straps. The fashion of the time of James I's death meant that the effigy legs would have been on view, and James was famously proud of his shapely calves. You can see how well modelled and smooth they are, and he would have been wearing silk stockings on the effigy. According to the description of 1907, actually his legs were covered with 2 pairs of stockings, an inner pair of woolen ones and an outer pair of silk. So he would have been warm. Accounts also show that 2 effigies, so by the Stuart times, they were obviously very keen on effigies. 2 effigies were made for James I's funeral. Apparently one of them got damaged. They were also set up in different places. So this would have been a challenge for Lea Marney. One was exclusively used at Denmark House and had articulated limbs and could be propped up. The king's sculptor, Maximilian Colt, was paid £10, 51 shillings, for making the body of the representation with several joints in the arms, legs and body to be moved to several postures. And in the same account, there is reference to item for making a representation suddenly to serve only at Denmark House until the funeral for the same price. It's a shame we don't have the effigy head, as great care would almost definitely have been taken to make sure that it was a realistic portrait of the king. Maximilian Colt was paid for making the representation's face and hands, and then received a further 16 shillings and 8p for his journey to Tibbles for the moulding of the king's face, showing that that effigy head was definitely based on a death mask. And it was painted by the king's sergeant painter, John de Critz, and 2 periwigs, 2 beards, and I guess 4 eyebrows for the 2 effigies were supplied by Daniel Parks. So there are, detailed accounts of the making of these very important, individualistic sculptures. The representation was also provided with an orb, scepter, and crown with diverse counterfeit stones on it. So I've been whittling on very fast for really quite a long time. However, I'm just going to show you some of the wax ones, just 1 or 2. I'm winding up, but I would like to offer a few words on the wax effigies, because when you go to the Abbey, you'll think that they look even weirder than the wooden ones, probably. So the tradition of making wooden funeral effigies and processing with them through the streets was discontinued after the death of Charles I, at least from the Abbeys, from the point of view of the monarchy. For obvious reasons, no effigy was made following Charles I's beheading outside the banqueting house Whitehall on the 30th of January 1649, and Parliament very ungenerously refused him burial at Westminster Abbey, and his embalmed body was apparently on public view at St James's Palace until his burial the following week at St George's Chapel, Windsor, on the 8th of February 1649. I guess that was an incredibly, obviously it was a very sensitive moment. So the first post-Civil War funeral effigy we have is for, this is James I's effigy in a sort of funeral hearse. I just wanted to show you the head and the body, and you can basically make out his feet and his legs, so his stockinged legs. Here we are. This is where I've moved on to, beg your pardon. This is Charles II. So he died in 1685. By the time of his the restoration in 1660, the royal funeral ceremonial had changed, and he was commemorated with a completely different type of effigy, as you see here. Between Charles II's death on the 6th of February, 1685, and his burial on the 14th of February, his body lay in state in the Painted Chamber in the Palace of Westminster. I can't tell you why they didn't make an effigy, but it just came across the road from the Palace of Westminster to Westminster Abbey. Perhaps embalming techniques had improved, perhaps he wasn't putrefying, but this was created because there was no tomb monument to signify the place that where his body was actually buried. The diarist John Evelyn recorded that the king was this night very obscurely buried in a vault under Henry VII's chapel without any manner of pomp and soon forgotten after all this vanity. But this swaggering effigy was created to mark the king's burial spot, and in March 1686, so sort of the following year, it was taken away for display in its own specially commissioned case. It reflects poet Andrew Marvell's description of Charles as of tall stature and sable hue, measuring 6 feet 2 inches. His face, I don't know how easily you can see it from here, but his face is quite dark. It's modelled in pigmented wax, and its dark tint is believed to reflect Charles's skin tone. And he's got these expressive wax hands, and the eyes are made of blown glass. He's actually wearing an enormous number of layers of costume. He's wearing his garter robes, but there are 17 layers, down to his silk underdrawers. So here's his doublet. Here's his silk underdrawers. Oh, and you'll catch a glimpse of those if you visit the galleries, because we made it was to the great inconvenience of our conservators, but we said, okay, we've got to show him being dressed, because that's something that you'll never see again. So they said, well, we haven't finished conserving him yet. Well, okay. So we had to stage the dressing of the 17 layers, and then they had to take them all off again to finish the work. But you can actually see the build-up and how much work there is actually in an effigy such as that. So the effigies, as I've sort of hinted all the way along, clothed or unclothed, received a lot of conservation treatment before we redisplayed them here. And all the historic garments were removed, cleaned, and repaired. There's sort of pest traps and worries about woolly bear, and we're especially for clothing, and they're all encased. And this provided us with a lot of new information. But it's a very different proposition looking after wax effigies dressed in rare items of clothing compared with wooden carvings. With global warming, it was actually something we did talk about back in 2018 or 2017, 2018, about how the waxes would fare up in our galleries. But I feel you can ask me about that later, because it is getting warmer and warmer. But as I mentioned earlier, following Charles II's death, the traditional function of the royal funeral effigy in England was seen to change. From that moment, effigies were almost never produced or processed for funerals, particularly royal ones. There were a few exceptions, as the odd, possibly emphasis on the odd, aristocratic family clung on to royal traditions. So this is the last example I'm going to give you. But we have these 3 effigies from the same family, the Sheffield family, the Dukes of Buckingham and Normanby. You've got Catherine, Duchess of Buckingham and Normanby, and 2 of her sons who predeceased her. Robert, Marquis of Normanby, the little one, who died in 1715, aged 3, and Edmund, the 2nd Duke, who died in 1735, aged 19. So Duchess Catherine was the illegitimate daughter, or so she claimed, of the exiled Stuart King James II, and she was notorious among her peers for insisting that they acknowledge her royal connections. She and her husband, John Sheffield, created Buckingham House, which later was acquired for George III, became Buckingham Palace. And when Edmund died in Rome on the 30th of October, 1735, he was the last surviving male heir. Catherine planned a magnificent funeral for him at Westminster Abbey, and she commissioned funeral effigies of both him and herself, which you see here. Newspapers reported of his funeral in January 1736 that the body was in an open chariot, the effigies in armour, lying on the coffin with two of His Grace's officers of the bedchamber sitting at the head and feet. And Catherine commissioned her own, though she was, well, I guess nowhere near death in 1735, because she didn't die until 1743, but she commissioned this effigy so she could, make sure she looked okay. And she clearly thought that it was a good portrait of her because she didn't destroy it. According to the Gentleman's Magazine, her effigy in wax, which she had by her ever since the Duke her son's funeral, dressed up in her coronation robes, was placed under a canopy of state and drawn in a car by 6 horses covered with black velvet. And that bowing to tradition, because she was making these claims about her descendancy from the Stuart monarchs, she was an exception. She was kind of the last, really. Few. This was the last funeral effigy in our collection to fulfill its traditional function, which you could say is fitting for a figure as obsessed with their royal connections as Duchess Catherine. We do have a few later ones. I'm not going to show you them. We have Nelson and we have Pitt, and they are dressed up in their clothes. The wax modelling, it's sort of a precursor of Madame Tussauds, which is just getting up and going. And the effigy of Nelson was apparently made just before his death. It's 1802, and he died in 1805. And his lover, Hamilton, what was her first name? Emma Hamilton, apparently said that it was a very good, she just wanted to sort of tweak the hair to make it look perfectly like him. So as I said, I really apologize. So these are some of the wonderful textiles that you find. I mean, so the Duchess Catherine's effigy is dressed in the latest Spitalfield silk. I mean, they're beautiful kind of reflections of costume of the time. You can see them all in their wonderful medieval setting in the Queen's Diamond Jubilee Galleries. And I would just say, I'm so sorry, I feel like I've been completely breathless, but I dare say you've been able to follow me, and it's been a pleasure speaking to you, and thank you so much for being here. And don't forget, there is one book about Henry V that poor John has brought all this way, so please, someone buy it. Thank you very much.
Well, that was fantastic. Galloped through effigies. Our experience of building the effigy, which we actually did in here, we didn't have, you're not to laugh too hard, we didn't have a beautiful wooden piece of wood to carve out. We had a dress dummy that my mother had got when Austin Reed went bust in Regent Street. And you have no idea, he was like the Incredible Hulk. And we had to try and turn that into the image that you saw there. And all of this cutting off of limbs and reorganizing was the opening gambit for dressing our effigy. So absolutely, the summary of what you've heard is the experience we went through too. Now, much more important, has anybody got any questions?
When they were all piled up, how did you identify James I effigy without a head?
Oh, that's a good question. I need to have another look at the 1907 reference, because it's possible he did have a head back then. I have to say, St. John Hope, who is the scholar and antiquary who wrote that long description, when you look at how he matched up what he thought we should have with what we actually had, sometimes he says, this is what we think we probably have here. But I'm persuaded. I mean, one thing we do have, which is actually very dodgy, Henry, Prince of Wales, somebody gave us his head separate from his body, and my conservator colleague said, so the head that we've got for Henry, Prince of Wales, on the label, we had to say, this is purportedly Henry, Prince of Wales's head. because it doesn't look like it could have come from the effigy. It looks more like there's a line of kings in the Tower of London in the Royal Armouries, and it looks more like that. But I said to her, as we were preparing this, well, you know, headless, 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 more doesn't make more. I think we've got a head, we should actually just put it with the body and make it clear on the label that this is, you know, supposedly, purportedly, possibly, hopefully.
Anthony, do you want to?
Thank you very much for a good talk. One of the things I was interested in is the dating of these effigies as a practice. Are you kind of suggesting that it's sort of late 14th century, or is it something that started with Edward II, although that was really to show that there was a body and that the king was dead in kind of very difficult circumstances? So could it be that that funerary practice developed from that sort of practical need, or was it something that was more general?
Everything that I've read is sort of based on Philip Linley's study to a degree, and Chris Given-Wilson, who's written on Edward III. And scholars seem to agree that Edward II was the first funeral effigy, because it is described, it is documented, though it is lost. And the suggestion that it's the first is related to the sort of horror story of his demise as to possibly the reason that it was created. And then after that, you know, after that, we kind of get into a cycle of people do the same thing. Was that good enough as an answer?
And I think Ross' question behind will be the last one.
Can I ask about death masks? You did allude to the use of death masks, possibly in the case of Edward III and in that of Henry VII. You said, I think, that they could have been based on death masks. Is there any instance, or what is the best documented the first well-documented reference to a death mask? And this practice obviously started during the period II continued afterwards. There was a death mask of Cromwell, and was there an effigy of Cromwell? I can't remember. But could you say just a bit more about that?
I suspect there was an effigy of Cromwell. Sorry?
I mean Oliver.
Yes. No, I knew you meant Oliver. The one that I mentioned of James I, that's definitely documented. The other, so Edward III's it's a conservation argument. There's no actual evidence. It's, you know, there's no documentary evidence for it being made from a death mask, but the conservators, people have said that because of the way the effigy is prepared with plaster, and that it could be based on a death mask. But my current conservation colleagues don't think that's likely. I'm trying to remember, we don't have Henry V's funeral effigy, but I have a suspicion that, oh no, hold on. No, he died in France. There were some that were made of leather, so this is not a very coherent. I think the only one that I am certain was definitely a documented death mask was James I. Henry VII's, there's been this article published and study by Philip Linley comparing the two busts that I showed on the screen, one at the V&A, both purportedly by Torrigiano, and so I think Philip Linley, because of what he considered, but it was back in the 80s, as the absolute contiguous, the dimensions are absolutely identical, he thinks that they therefore, a terracotta bust and a funeral effigy must have been based on the same death mask. Well, that's not documented. That's that's suggested, that's, you know, that's speculated, but it seems more likely than not.